Elsa stood at the guest room window and looked out onto the courtyard as it was illuminated by the overhanging moon. It had been nearly a week since she had arrived at the Southern Isles, and during her stay, the only time that she had to herself was the nights which she would spend in her room. The rest of her time was spent with members of the royal family, mainly with King George, as he ensured she received a seemingly heartfelt apology any time they ran into one of Hans's siblings. She briefly looked around the room at all of the gifts she had been given during her stay, which included a small pot with a flower that's known to grow only on the Southern Isles. "This is all too much," Elsa thought to herself as she looked around. "And what's to be expected? Arendelle is just supposed to forgive Hans' attempted coup simply because his family apologized?" She looked back toward the window and down at the stable that had the two guards standing in front of it. "How can I know it was sincere when I haven't truly heard from the wretch himself?" Elsa placed her hands on the windowsill as she leaned closer to the window. She continued to stare intently down at the stables as she lost herself in thought. Who's to say if the rest of the kingdom is genuinely sorry? As Anna said, this could all still be a ploy to make me more trusting of my enemies. Elsa's index finger began to tap on the windowsill. But what if I'm wrong? What if Hans did act alone and the king is trying to make up for his son's mistake? As she continued to look down upon the courtyard and ponder whether or not the Southern Isles should be considered a threat or not, Elsa noticed a bit of commotion among the guards that were posted outside of the stable. Another guard had approached, and though it was unclear what the group had been talking about, Elsa watched as the two guards who had been on watch duty looked around them, and when they were sure that they wouldn't get caught, they both followed the other guard away from the stable and out of the courtyard. Where are they going? Elsa wondered. She took a moment and continued to look at the gate they used to exit the courtyard, wondering if they would be coming back. After a moment, Elsa got an idea. If I want answers from the man himself, there might not be a better time to get them, she thought to herself as she began to open the window. Elsa hesitated briefly. Is this smart? She wondered before shaking the thought out of her head. I need answers. As she began to lean her body out of the window to her room, a white frost began to form in the air around her hands, and as she lifted her arms forward, a thin, icy path began to form outside of the window. Elsa slowly slid down the path as it formed in front of her and brought her right to the gate in front of the stable. Only the faintest sound was made when she touched the ground, but she still took a moment to look around and make sure there were no guards to interrupt her. Elsa stood up straight and took in a deep breath as she reached her hand out and grabbed on the latch that kept the stables closed. She slowly began to open the door, but quickly stopped as the hinge began to creak. She waited a second before continuing to open the gate and stepping into the stable. She closed the gate behind her and made her way across the mud and hay-covered floor to the corner of the room where she could see Hans. I still can't believe this is what he's become, she thought to herself. The sound of Elsa walking across the stable floor began to wake Hans up. He rolled over and opened his eyes. It took them a moment to adjust, but he was in shock as he realized that it was Elsa standing in front of him and not one of the guards trying to prank him again. He began to sit up, but before he could do or say anything, Elsa stopped him. I would stay calm if I were you, she said as she gestured for Hans to look at her hand where ice was beginning to form in the air. Now, you are going to answer my questions, quietly, and if I like what you say, I'm going to go back to my room and you can go back to sleep. She took a step toward Hans. Nod if you understand. Hans nodded slowly. Why did you do it? Asked Elsa. Hans was taken aback by the question. He didn't know how to answer. Elsa took another step forward and now had frost emanating out of both of her hands. I won't ask you again. Hans had to think quickly. He knew he had to say something, but knew that he couldn't tell her the truth. He needed to make it seem like only he was to blame. Elsa took another step forward and Hans lifted his hands. Okay, I'll tell you, he said quietly. I did it because I loved your sister. Elsa looked confused and enraged. Anna, she was the light I had never seen before, and you tried to keep me away from her, all because you didn't know me. Hans grew a bit more confident in his lie. I had to get rid of you. It was the only way that we could be together. Anna? He hardly even knew Anna. Elsa thought to herself as she noticed Hans' eyes shifting back and forth. "You're lying," she said firmly. "Why did you do it?" Elsa asked once more, only this time raising her voice a bit. Hans chuckled as he knew that someone likely heard Elsa and the guards would be coming any second. "I'll never submit to you or your questions," Hans said calmly. "You will never get an apology from me, Ice Queen. It will never happen." Elsa stood up straight as she heard the sound of the guards opening the gate to the courtyard. She knew she only had a second to escape before being caught with the prisoner. Elsa quickly made her way out of the stable and closed the gate, and as quickly as she had descended, she made her way back up the ice ramp as it disappeared behind her. She was back inside of her room before the guards made it back to their positions. Elsa made her way over to her bed and did her best to get some sleep. As she drifted off, she couldn't help but think about what she was going to do about the Southern Isles once she returned home to Arendelle. Hans' eyes shot open as he felt someone grasp his shoulders and begin shaking him. He half expected it to be the bothersome Ice Queen again. He was relieved, however, when he awoke to find that it was his brother Lars and the two guards, which was a sign that it was time for him to begin preparing for his journey. It must have been just before sunrise, and Hans quickly took note that his brother was holding his finger up to his mouth, letting him know to keep quiet. One of the guards dropped a pile of clothes at Hans' feet that weren't spotless, but were much cleaner than the filthy rags he'd been wearing in the stable. Hans chuckled to himself. "Mustn't want me smelling up the ship," he thought to himself as he began to get changed. The group slowly made their way out of the stable and toward the courtyard gate. As Hans emerged from the filth-filled stable for the first time in months, he couldn't help but look toward the window that led into the guest room. "Are you watching us from up there, witch?" Hans thought to himself as he couldn't help but wonder whether or not Elsa was awake and watching them leave. But with no sign of her in the window, the troop continued to make their way around the castle and headed down to the dock where all of the cargo was getting prepared to be loaded on board the ship that was set to bring Elsa back to her homeland. As they continued to walk down the path, the dock finally came into sight, and the first thing that both Hans and Lars noticed was their father, King George, who was standing on the dock awaiting their arrival. Hans dropped his head and began looking at the floor as they grew closer to their father. "My king," Lars said, "it's a good morning for a trip, is it not?" he asked with a sarcastic tone to his voice. "Quiet," demanded the king. "Don't talk, just listen." He looked over Lars' shoulder to Hans, who was still looking at the ground. "That means you too, boy." Hans hesitantly lifted his head to meet his father's stare. "You will both be making your journey to and from the ship in this," said the king as he gestured for his sons to look over to a small padded crate. "Lars, I presume you remember the rest." Lars nodded his head. The king took a single step toward his sons. "Good, because remember, there will be no one coming to save you from failure this time." He was speaking to both his sons, but the king couldn't break his attention away from Hans. He scoffed quietly. "Now, get out of my sight." Hans began to walk towards the crate, all the while thinking to himself, there is no way this is going to be a comfortable trip. "After you, kid," Lars said to Hans as he placed his hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll only be in here for a portion of the trip." Hans rolled his eyes, but knew that there was nothing that he could do to fight the circumstances. So he began stepping into the crate before sitting and curling up as tight as he could in order to make room for Lars, who was right behind him. "Shut it and load it," demanded the king. Hans could hear his father's footsteps fade away, and before they knew it, everything around them went dark as the lid to the crate was placed on. The two struggled to breathe as they could feel the crate being moved around and loaded onto the bottom of the ship. Once they were on board the ship, there was no telling how long they would have to wait before departing. It was only after they departed that the two would be able to finally emerge from their cramped crate. What felt like hours passed, and the two brothers could hear a bunch of commotion on the ship above them before finally hearing the ringing sound of the departure bell. "Finally," Hans thought to himself. "I think it's safe now," Lars whispered as the two brothers slowly lifted the lid to the crate and were finally able to stretch their legs. Lars quickly checked that the door to the storage room was closed before turning back to Hans. "I'm not looking forward to doing that again." "What do you mean again?" Hans asked quietly. Lars looked puzzled for a second before realizing, that's right. Father wanted me to explain it to you. As we get closer to Arendelle, guards will ring the bell again, and that will be our cue to stuff ourselves back into the crate." Hans' eyes widened. "Not now, little brother. It'll be for a short time," Lars continued. "We'll go back into the crate so that the guards can safely unload us into the kingdom. Now, Father assured me that the ship would be loaded with food and other cargo that would see us dropped off at the processing center. Well, how does that help us? We'll still be surrounded by guards who will be unpacking the goods," Hans asked Lars. "While the rest of the guards are focusing on bringing all of the cargo to the processing center, we'll have our guards bring our crate to an abandoned section of the warehouse where we'll quickly exit the crate and no one will be the wiser." Lars ended quietly, but confidently. Hans looked at his brother for a moment, but knew that he didn't have a say in the plan, so he just accepted. "Any questions?" asked Lars. Hans shook his head no, and the storage room grew quiet. Lars looked over to Hans, curious as to why he wasn't talking much. "Hans, are you all right? You know you've never been the one to keep quiet." Hans looked to his brother and took in a deep breath before quietly telling him, "The Ice Queen visited the stables last night." A shocked look overcame Lars. "She wanted to know why I tried to take Arendelle." Lars stepped closer to his brother. "You didn't tell her, did you? I mean, if Father finds out you—" Hans cut Lars off. "Of course not. I'm not a child." Lars exhaled in relief. "Good. You know the world can never find out about what our family has done, right? If that happens—" Lars paused before finishing his sentence. "Well, nobody is ready for that war." Hans nodded his head. "I understand, brother. I'm not going to let you down. This isn't about me, Hans, but we have to do as we're told. You know that," Lars said as he began to look toward the ground. Silence fell over the room again as the two brothers sat on the floor of the storage room. They both leaned back against the crates that had been locked away with them. The silence was broken after a moment by Hans as he looked to his older brother and said, "This time, we're going to get this right. I will not return empty-handed."